The United States is a melting pot of a range of different cultures and beliefs from around the world, and it has the highest number of foreign-born people living in their country out of any other country in the world, with 44.8 million Americans having been foreign-born in 2018. Despite this, there's still a lot of xenophobia and bigotry against immigrants in this country, and we still have a powerful political party that attempts to limit the amount of immigrants we let in and fuel xenophobia through propaganda, as well as a former president that builds his base of support based on the idea of building a physical wall to keep out immigrants, and spew bigoted rhetoric against Hispanic/Latino immigrants. In this video, we're going to go over common talking points and arguments against immigrants, and talk about why immigrants are great for our country and why we should continue to take in a lot of immigrants. In order to look at whether or not immigrants cause lower wages, we can look at the academic literature surrounding whether or not immigrant competition in the labor market actually lowered wages for native-born Americans. Findings done by George Borjas found an overall increase in wages for native-born citizens by around 0.6%, with a decrease in the wages of high school dropouts by around 1.7%. If we just use Borjas' data, we would come to the reasonable conclusion that immigrants increase the income for the vast majority of Americans, and therefore there isn't a major issue here. On the other hand, using data from Ottaviano and Perry, they come to a similar conclusion to Borjas, except for the fact that they actually predicted an increase in wages for high school dropouts by around 1.1%, an overall increase of 0.5%. Those numbers would come to an even more favorable conclusion when it comes to the argument that immigrants do not decrease wages. And the only true academic argument here is the 2.8% difference that we see among high school dropouts.
I gotta do it, man.
Dude.
While it is true that immigrants increase the supply of labor in the economy, there are other factors that limit competition between immigrants and native-born workers in the economy. The first one being that immigrants tend not to be in competition with most natives for jobs when looking at educational statuses. The plurality of immigrants have less than a high school diploma, with 27.7% not having one, as opposed to only 8.7% of native-born citizens having below a high school education. In addition to that, the plurality of native-born citizens have some college or associate's degree, with 31% as opposed to 18.8% of immigrants being at that level of education. From this, we can infer that natives and immigrants tend not to be competing for the same jobs at the same level of education requirement. Another reason for limited competition between immigrants and natives is due to the difficulties with language that many immigrants have to deal with. Lack of communication skills due to not knowing English well enough for many immigrants will likely land in more manual labor jobs, while natives take more communication-oriented jobs that are higher paying. For example, in a restaurant, an immigrant who has difficulty with English speaking would take a busboy or dishwasher position, while native-born citizens take jobs such as waitresses and waiters, which are communication-oriented and are higher paying. This specialization of labor that matches the abilities of both groups raises the wages for both. Other reasons for the increase in wages for natives due to immigration are the fact that immigrants are much more likely to start a business, therefore basically employing themselves, as well as investors investing in capital stock in response to increases in population, and the idea of a scale effect, which essentially means that an increase in the size of our economy causes an increase in the demand of labor. On the other hand, other research from George Borjas told a different story than what I've been saying as of now. Research from Borjas, which analyzed the effect of the Mariel boat lift on the Miami economy, found a decrease in wages of 10 to 30%, concentrated in natives that have below a high school diploma. This study is one of the most referenced studies by people who will consider themselves anti-immigration or immigration restrictionists, but the study has many problems that, when fixed, dissipate these negative findings that Borjas gets. To start, despite the fact that Borjas found a large decrease in wages for people below a high school diploma, there was a very large increase in wages for people with a high school diploma but not a college education, to such a severe degree that it actually caused an overall increase in wages for people below a college education. In addition to that, the Mariel boat lift's long-term effect on wages was severely put into question, as Hispanic wages recovered sharply in Miami, even though they were the most vulnerable group to suffer wage decreases. Because of the fact that they had similar language and educational statuses to the new Cubans coming into the city. The most damning finding of all, though, comes from the economists Michael Clemens and Jennifer Hunt, who discovered a large sample bias due to Borjas and his data collectors changing who they would survey. When this was accounted for, their negative findings completely dissipated. In order to strengthen the point from before, a report from 2009 which investigated the effects of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which legalized over 2.7 million undocumented immigrants in the span of 5 years, found that between 1988 and 1992, the law caused mean hourly wages for the general U.S. worker to increase by 15%, with an increase of 16.1% for citizen workers. The report says that, quote, almost immediately IRCA-based legalization had the effect of giving rights to more workers, raising the low-wage floor of the economy, reducing the demand for easily exploitable immigrants, and reducing illegal crossings and apprehensions without huge expenditures on a border wall. We can use this report to conclude that a mass legalization of the current undocumented immigrants we have today would have immense positive impact on the country and would drastically improve the well-being of all ordinary people in this country. Legalizing illegal immigrants is just without a doubt a way better alternative to mass deportation, as research from the New American Economy shows that if we deported all of the illegal immigrants that currently exist in the U.S., we would see a 6.4% shrink in the labor force and a 5.7% shrink in the economy, or a $1.6 trillion shrink in GDP. There would also be a direct cost of $409 billion to the federal government, who would be giving out funds on top of that to deport these people in the first place. So it's just a completely nonsensical policy. The idea that immigrants come here and abuse the welfare system and collect from our quote-unquote generous social programs is a very common idea among conservatives and a completely nonsensical talking point that's existed for a long time, and a point that is simply impossible to back up with any reliable data. Data from 2006 tells us that of the $88 billion spent by governments on welfare for non-elderly adults during that year, illegal immigrants took around $1.1 billion of that, which is a rate that is far below the percent of the population. Immigrants in general are also less likely to use welfare programs compared to native-born Americans, and even when they are on welfare, they use less of it. To try to put it into perspective, if native-born Americans use welfare at the same rate and use just as much of it as immigrants did, the welfare state would literally shrink by 43%, or in total numbers by $1.3 trillion.
It worked!
Oh no!
Look! SpongeBob's giant!
The honest truth is that immigrants really do the opposite of abuse our welfare system. They generally give more than they take in. They make large net contributions to Social Security and Medicare due to their ages, ineligibility, and the fact that they are more likely to retire in another country. While I would support getting rid of the rules that make a lot of immigrants ineligible, as a matter of fact today they are a large net contribution to the welfare state. The idea that immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, increase crime in our country is a fucking insane position, and it's impossible to argue that illegal immigrants are more likely to commit crime compared to the native-born population. While there are many things which limit the resources and data that we have to research the topic, all evidence that has attempted to determine the crime rates of illegal immigrants compared to legal native-born citizens has shown that illegal immigrants do not commit nearly as much crime as native-born citizens. Government commissions and academic papers relating to the link between immigration and crime found no link between the two in the years 1986, 1909, 1931, 1994, and more recent years as well. In no mass immigration cycle at any point in American history has there been a crime increase because of said immigration. But to talk specifically about illegal immigrants, it is important to start by saying that being an illegal immigrant in the U.S. is not a crime in and of itself, but rather is considered a civil infraction, which is different from a crime. When you commit a crime, you are punished by fines or jail time or whatever the case may be. When you commit a civil infraction, the government responds by correcting the infraction, which in the case of an illegal immigrant, it would be to deport you. Now that that is out of the way, research that has attempted to determine the incarceration rate of illegal immigrants has found that their incarceration rate is actually half that of the native-born population, with legal immigrants having half as much as illegal immigrants. According to the research, native-born Americans have an incarceration rate of 1,471 per 100,000, with illegal immigrants having 756 per 100,000 and legal immigrants having 364 per 100,000. More reliable numbers than that come from the state of Texas, which is the only state that keeps track of the immigration status of the incarcerated. In the state of Texas, which is a conservative state that borders Mexico and gets a huge swath of illegal immigrants, the incarceration rate for illegal immigrants is still half of the native-born population without any controls for age, ethnicity, education, or other characteristics. Another common argument against immigration is that when educated immigrants come to the U.S. from developing nations, they drain said developing nation of the highly skilled, intelligent workers that will help the country grow and prosper. While it is a very understandable argument, there isn't any evidence for the idea that high-skilled immigrants immigrating away actually hurts the destination nation. When educated or highly skilled immigrants come to richer nations that have far more opportunity for them to get paid for the skills that they hold, they can increase the incomes of people from the destination by sending money back home to friends and family. This immigration to richer nations also incentivizes people to acquire skills and get an education that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and that leads to an increase in human capital. The increasing of income as well as the acquiring of skills by people in that country will help said country develop and do so much better. A non-economic argument against immigrants concerns our American culture, and the idea that immigrants are a harm to American culture and the ideas and beliefs that we cherish in our country. For people who are concerned about the incoming immigrants from Mexico assimilating to our culture, the academic literature points to the conclusion that the current wave of immigrants are actually assimilating as well or even better than immigrants of previous generations. Personally, I couldn't give a shit less whether or not the immigrants that come here decide to assimilate to our culture or not, as long as the ideas that they bring aren't harmful to others, which doesn't seem to be the case if there are any harmful ideas being brought in by this current wave of immigrants. Immigrants can also bring to us the positive things about their culture that become mainstream and adopted by the broader U.S. culture. There is, at this point, an entire list of foods, music, ideas, clothing that have been brought to us by different cultures over our century-long history as a nation that accepts immigrants into our country. The great thing about the United States in a very unique sense is that it is much easier to assimilate here than it is to assimilate to the cultures of the European countries, due to the fact that European countries have certain labor market regulations that make it more difficult for lower skilled immigrants to find jobs, which in turn slows down the ability for immigrants to assimilate and slows economic growth. The second major reason why assimilation is easier in the US is due to assimilation being a two-way process. For immigrants to successfully assimilate, they must first be accepted by the native-born population, as well as taking the customs, mores, and values of the natives. There's also an obligation on the part of the native population to accept the immigrants and their children, as well as the customs, religion, and habits of the immigrants as part of the cultural fabric of the nation. The reason why that would be so hard for Europeans is because the only things that distinguish Europeans are their ethnic, linguistic, and cultural features that have existed for millennia, as opposed to the US, which is famously a melting pot, and whose culture advances as immigrants come in. Despite this seemingly obvious fact, there is still concern among conservatives and people who oppose immigration in the US that immigrants will destroy our, quote, national sovereignty. The argument goes that if we don't have control over our borders, then America will lose its ability to govern as a sovereign entity. While this may make sense intuitively, it assumes that our government institutions are choosing to have that policy. Even in the most extreme instance of totally open borders, we would still maintain our national sovereignty as long as government institutions are making that decision knowingly. Using a standard definition of a government, which is an institution that has a monopoly or near monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a certain geographical area, we can determine that keeping out non-violent, non-state actors who do not intend to overthrow the government would do nothing to maintain our national sovereignty, as the only threats to sovereignty are militaries of other nations, insurgents, and terrorists. If anything, a more relaxed border control policy would increase our national sovereignty. If we accept the correct notion that immigrants benefit our economy and increase the tax pool, it would allow our military and national security apparatuses to be stronger due to such effects, and would therefore help us better counter true threats to American sovereignty. To better prove this point more, the U.S. had no federal restriction on immigration from 1790 to 1875, and during that entire time, they fought 3 wars and were able to successfully maintain their national sovereignty. To conclude, anti-immigration is essentially an arguable position if you hold the belief that we should strive to improve the well-being of people. Immigration is one of the best things that the U.S. has at its disposal to improve its country, and is the backbone of our nation and has been for centuries. Being anti-immigration is one of the most anti-American things that you can be, and it's a disgrace that we have a political party and former presidents who rail against it so hard. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you have any contentions with the video or if you want to add more to what I have said, please leave a comment.